Turkey and the Gulf, new realignments and new priorities. In 2021, Turkey made significant efforts to normalize its relationship with Armenia, Egypt, the Gulf, and Israel after years of disagreements. Ankara's determination to end its regional isolation is motivated by many reasons. The most important of all is probably seeking normalization and detente to boost bilateral economic relations as well as stabilization to solidify its gain in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Azerbaijan. Turkish diplomatic efforts were received with different level of reciprocity, while Egypt and Saudi Arabia remain on the fence. Reconciliation with the UAE and Israel is advancing on a faster pace. A proof of this new regional dynamics, the UAE, once portrayed as a better enemy in Ankara, has committed to invest $10 billion in the Turkish economy. This investment and other promises of increased bilateral trade was welcomed and celebrated by pro-government media outlets here in Turkey. Erdogan's recent visit to Abu Dhabi further demonstrated this trend with more cooperation deals on the line. Meanwhile, President Erdogan also announced that Turkey will work to improve its ties with Saudi Arabia. The two countries' foreign ministers met in May last year and committed to holding regular consultations. Experts anticipated more movement between Riyadh and Ankara in the beginning of 2022, and the Turkish president even announced a visit during February. But good intentions still await to convert into tangible results. Today, we are honored to host a prestigious panel of GCC and Turkey experts. Welcome everyone on behalf of the Sharp Forum. Last week, we hosted a webinar in which we discussed the overall ongoing regional de-escalation dynamics. Are they sustainable? Could they converge and reconfigure the MENA regional political and security order? What are the challenges and opportunities they could face or create? For who missed the debate, I kindly urge you to watch this recording on our YouTube channel. Today, with our esteemed guests, we will go in depth and analyze how this de-escalation dynamics are translated between the GCC and Turkey in particular. We have people joining us over Zoom and others on YouTube and Facebook. Welcome all. Please participate and share the links of the webinar on your social media accounts, and kindly share your question with us either here in the chat box on Zoom or in the live stream comment section on YouTube. Without further ado, I will turn to our expert guests, wishing them a pleasant and constructive debate. And first, I will give the floor to Dr. Simon Mabon, who is a professor of international politics at Lancaster University, where he directs the Richardson Institute. He holds a PhD in international relations from the University of Leeds and is the director of the CPAD project, funded by the Carnegie Corporation, which looks at the impact of the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran on the contemporary Middle East. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I'm hoping that my internet connection stays solid and secure throughout my remarks. A really timely event and a really important one that allows us to look at some really key shifting dynamic regional politics. And it's something that's provoked a great deal of thought in recent days as I've been preparing my remarks today, reaching out to friends, colleagues in Riyadh, across the kingdom, and in Turkey to hear their thoughts on where they think this relationship between Saudis and Turkey is at. And it came back with some interesting findings, and I'll try and share some of those in the Saudi position. We need to look at Riyadh's position strategically in the region right now. And it's not a particularly positive one. I think for many, Saudi Arabia is increasingly isolated, increasingly trapped in foreign policy challenges, the quagmire in Yemen, increasing uncertainty in Lebanon, having to move away from long-standing allies such as the Hariri family to find local actors who can support their broad agendas outside the Sunni community. There's uncertainty over the nuclear deal, what that might mean for the kingdom, if indeed there is a deal, what might happen if there isn't a deal. There's uncertainty over talks with Iran. The Saudi economy, like most, has been hit by COVID-19. It's also been hit by a hugely expensive conflict in Yemen. But also, and I think this is really important for its broader efforts to reposition itself under Mohammed bin Salman, and its standing in the Muslim world. Its prestige has been dramatically affected by conflict in Yemen, allegations of human rights abuses, the Khashoggi incident, and other issues that relate to human rights and the challenge posed by human rights that the kingdom doesn't seem to be addressing in the most positive way. So there's a number of challenges, and I think one of the other ones is that the kingdom is increasingly isolated. It's isolated without strong relationships with other regional powers, Iran, Turkey, and Israel, for example. Yes, it has a relationship with the UAE, a good one, but there are cracks. There are cracks with regard to Yemen and indeed elsewhere. And I think because of that, it feels particularly isolated. With the US in an increasingly precarious position, Biden administration cracking down on Saudi Arabia, trying to facilitate an end to the war in Yemen, trying to revive the nuclear deal, trying to facilitate improvement in relations with Iran, the kingdom feels isolated. It feels somewhat alone. And when you combine that with a desire to regain its status, to address the challenges that have come out of the war in Yemen, insecurity, precarious politics across the region, you see Saudi's broad strategic policy of countering Islamists, ensuring the stability and safety of monarchical regimes, and countering Iran is an increasingly lonely project. And I think this is where we come to Turkey. Turkey has had a long and complex relationship with the Saudis in recent years, much like the Emiratis and much like other states in the Gulf. Turkish-Saudi relations have been incredibly complex. And right at the heart of this matter is the question of Islamism and this perception that Turkey was leading a Sunni, quote-unquote, Islamist bloc, if you will. But in light of a number of different things, I think there is the beginning of an opening, but that opening might not be as large or as positive as some might think. Now, why does Turkey matter? Well, I think Turkey matters for a number of reasons. One, it's perhaps the easiest of those regional powers to cultivate relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Developing a relationship with Turkey is far easier strategically, politically, logistically, than developing relations with Iran or Israel, for obvious reasons. And doing that, I think, would boost kingdom and regional affairs. It would end stalemate in regional developments. It would embolden the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It would create a political space for maneuverings. It would give a sense of political capital to the kingdom that's been lacking. Having Turkey as a regional ally would go some way to addressing the instability and insecurity of not having the US and not being able to count on the US. So there's good reasons for that. Of course, there are economic reasons. The Saudis need money. They need to be able to draw money in from NEOM, and they need to be able to revive their economy as MBS is trying to facilitate this transition away from a carbon-based economy. So there's a lot of strategic reasons for doing so. There's a lot of opportunities to increase trade, to get alliances, to get diplomatic cover, to get some strategic support and military support. After all, Turkey has been engaging in conflicts across the region, and Saudi Arabia can learn from Turkey. And it would do better, perhaps, to learn from Turkey than learning from Greece, which is what it's been doing and engaging with the Greek military in recent years. So there's some good strategic reasons there. It would also allow it to reassert its position of leadership. But as I've said, there are some challenges. And whilst there is this apparent opening, I don't think the opening is quite as strong as some would have you believe. So the challenges are, I think, predominantly threefold. There's the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and some Islamists. There are tensions with Egypt, and then there's the Khashoggi affair. So we know that the Saudis have got a long, complex history with the Muslim Brotherhood and with Islamist movements broadly. We know that that's one of the reasons why there was the blockade of Qatar, as Christian and this panel has written about extensively. We know that there are tensions, and there have been tensions between Turkey and Egypt. And of course, the Khashoggi affair, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, not all that long ago. And things got very personal after that. The Khashoggi incident led to a personal breakdown in relations between the leadership of Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And so while the regional landscape has changed and the quote-unquote threat posed by Islamist groups such as the Brotherhood has decreased, tensions between Turkey and Egypt have decreased, the legacy of the Khashoggi affair on a personal level, I think, remains. We know that that Turkey has come out and said that it largely supports the findings of a Saudi court. So Turkey is clearly trying to reach out to the Saudis and close that distance over the case of the Khashoggi affair. But I think what's really important to note is that there is a tension and there is a personal dimension to what is going on here. The Saudi leadership, Mohammed bin Salman in particular, was deeply offended by what happened with the Khashoggi affair. And Saudis themselves have a deep distrust of Mr. Erdogan. There was a lot of anger. Speaking with Saudi friends recently, they refer to comments such as Erdogan, drawing parallels with monkeys. So there's some deeply problematic framing. There's some deeply xenophobic, bordering on the racist terminology being used at a public level, at a sort of a grassroots level, to represent anger and frustration that many Saudis have towards Turkey. And so whilst Mr. Erdogan claims to want to visit Riyadh, those claims have been refuted by Saudi officials who have expressed anger and frustration about how Erdogan expressed this desire. Whilst there have been positive overtures from King Salman towards Turkey and vice versa from Mr. Erdogan, those positive overtures haven't really come back from Mohammed bin Salman. And an Arab League statement sort of points to this recalcitrance from certain members of the upper echelons of the Saudi leadership with regard to a normalization. And so whilst there's still talk about Erdogan visiting Riyadh, the latest suggestion is that it could well be during the last 10 days of Ramadan that Erdogan is allowed to visit, which isn't all that long away. But when you think that he's been made to wait since the end of 2021, and there doesn't seem to be a good reason for this beyond something deeply personal, then I think there is something else at play here beyond the sort of the strategic issues that may be at play. Because after all, there's a lot at stake. The desire to consolidate the kingdom's position, to boost the private sector, possible defense deals, consolidate its position in the post-JCPOA world, consolidate in an uncertain US regional climate, increasing instability and uncertainty in the Horn of Africa, where Turkey is engaging with other members of the GCC. That personal dimension remains. Personal politics is important, as we know. And after all, the AKP remains an Islamist party. So I think it's perhaps a little soon to talk about a full-on rapprochement. I think there is scope for it, but there are still some serious issues that need to be addressed, some trust that needs to be built. But if it can be, then this is a relationship that can be hugely profitable
Thank you, Simon. So it seemed that we had a lucky streak because your internet connection started to break off just towards the end. So we were able to hear you all through your very valuable contribution. I will just quickly summarize some of the points that you made. You mentioned that Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, is also has been facing more regional isolation the last period. It's facing problems in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and also some financial strain from the COVID-19, as well as other mega projects it's engaged in. And this set the environment and set the political willingness, let's say, to engage with other regional actors. And in between the three, in which Saudi Arabia, with whom Saudi Arabia could reach out, Turkey seems a more logical destination. However, the personal breakdown and relationship between the two leadership is overcomplicating this approach, and we will see if something will develop by the end of April, during the last 10 days of Ramadan, and whether this will lead to further rapprochement as the two leaders will hopefully meet. So next, I would like to welcome Dr. Khalid Mzaini, who is an associate professor at Zayed University, Abu Dhabi. He was working before at Qatar University, where he taught the Gulf study. Where he taught in the Gulf Studies program, and is right now also a visiting research fellow at the LCE. Prior to joining Qatar University, he was also a research fellow at London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Khalid, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your valuable remarks.
Thank you very much, Sinan, and also thanks to Simon. He elaborated into many important issues in regards to GCC, Turkey, de-escalation. I'll focus on the case of UAE in particular here, try to explain the reasons behind, or some of the reasons behind this, I would call it a de-escalation or a rapprochement. And the question is that the rapprochement, is it from the UAE or the Turkish side? Who's started this initiative in particular? If we look at the last 10 years and before this normalization of relations between UAE and Turkey, one would never expect that these two countries that have fought a proxy war for 10 years, I would say, have decided to come and work together. If we look at Libya in particular, Syria and other parts of the region, we would see that these two countries, UAE and Turkey, have engaged in direct or indirect proxy wars. And to be honest, if one would summarize the conflict in the Middle East, it was between the countries siding with countries supporting Muslim Brotherhood and countries that are against Muslim Brotherhood. So the whole region was fighting each other, countries in the region fighting each other. The problems are within the region because of the regional actors. One would think 20 or 30 years before that external actors would contribute to the instabilities in the region, but we started to see in the last 20 years an emergence of smaller states playing a significant role in the region, but at the same time clashing with other already existing regional powers. And of course, Turkey here, with no doubt, is the most powerful regional country in the region. I would say that the shift from UAE towards Turkey is due really to a number of reasons, not just because of what we have seen of the conflicts in the regional changes, but also because of the UAE's new vision towards the next 50 years. It has completed 50 years and it started to draw new line for its future. However, I would like to draw a very important note here on regards to the foreign policies, not only of the UAE, but most of the countries in the Middle East. One of the main reasons why there is this rapprochement is because foreign policies are highly personalized, and we haven't seen a lot of changes that happen in the last 20 years because of institutional agreements or consensus between a number of actors in the region. But foreign policies are highly personalized, whether it is from the UAE side or is from the Turkish side, because any sudden change that we see in the region is a clear reflection of this external behavior of particular figures that we see from the Turkish and the UAE side. And this has contributed significantly, particularly from the UAE, when seeing the National Security Advisor visiting Turkey, initiating this dialogue between Turkey and UAE, which later on led to strengthening and signing several agreements. And therefore, I would very much say that this classical understanding of foreign policies of the Middle Eastern state is because this personalization of foreign policies that still continues until now. If we think about the last 40 or 50 years, one would say that there is little change. It is a centralization of power, control over state behavior. The second aspect that has contributed actually to this rapprochement is the structural behavior of some state or structural changes. I think after Turkey spending significant amount of money and support in Turkey and in Libya, as well as UAE is engaging in a war in Yemen, it has significantly exhausted these two countries in particular. They are financially exhausted, and therefore they have realized that what the outcomes of the last 10 years is that it had an impact over their economies. And this is clearly in particular with Turkey we've seen, and also UAE, the withdrawal from Yemen is not only financially, but the financial side played a significant role in understanding why there was this shift and change in the foreign. So these countries are exhausted in the region. They have done and used different tools in the region in order to influence and exert power over other states. What did we see, and what happened in the last 10 years? That these countries started to shift and change their strategies. One would expect that why this change happened with UAE in particular, not with Saudi Arabia, or other countries. We have to agree, and probably Dr. Ba'aboud later on can elaborate even further on that, is that there is no consensus among or with the GCC states, with the foreign or with the in the foreign policies of the Gulf state. There is a lot of disagreement between the GCC state. We have seen that in regards to Iran, the lack of consensus in regards to Iran, and also now we see that if one would like to explain, how do you explain the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia toward Turkey and UAE? We see that there is no consensus. One state is improving and trying to strengthen its relation, the other is still in the process. Even we think about Qatar, Oman, and Kuwait. So there is this kind of lack of agreement between GCC states, which I think one would expect that might happen later on, especially from the side of Saudi Arabia, that it is important to re-establish or strengthen relations with Saudi Arabia in particular. So this also is a result of several other aspects. What Simon has alluded to is in particular the issue of Khashoggi, relations with Egypt, and so on. So there are a number of factors that contributed to the lack of agreement between the GCC state or having one clear policy toward Turkey. We have seen some consensus between UAE and Saudi Arabia in terms of boycotting some of the Turkish products in the last couple of years. But now when we see the opposite, that the Turkish products or business in both countries, we haven't seen agreement. And it is clear that maybe it is much stronger on the Saudi side. One would have said, well, it's probably UAE that started this boycott. But if we want to look at what has happened in the last couple of months, we've seen there is a much or a faster pace from the UAE in terms of strengthening, speeding up the process of signing several agreements. And also, if one would think that what would be the picture in the next 5 years in particular, I think I don't want to be too optimistic, but as I said, because this personalization of foreign policies, we might see change anytime also. You know, I'm not kind of that person who would say, well, yes, now they have signed a $10 billion fund between the two countries, and that can guarantee a strong relationship for the next 5 years or 10 years. I think in Middle East politics in particular, it is really difficult to predict that this can be sustained for the next 5 or 10 years. Why? Because the nature of political system in the lack of a mutual interest between different actors in the region does not really create an optimistic future for the region. What is needed probably that there is strong mutual interest. Now, of course, this economic dimension is very much driving this rapprochement between the two countries. It's particularly from the Turkish side, I think, that they really need this. Now, maintaining this relationship for the next 5 to 10 years is not easy. I remember that UAE changing behavior and Turkish regional interest might clash again. You know, the question that we can probably predict what would happen if there is a complete resolution about the Libyan case in particular. You know, how would the UAE and UAE and Turkey come to an agreement about what's happening in Libya and also what's happening in Syria in particular? If there are a clear-cut solutions for these regional conflicts between these two actors in the region, then yes, we might expect a very healthy relationship in the next 5 to 10 years. Sinan, do I have time or?
Yes, you do have still 5 minutes more.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, just two more points just to conclude about the next. I think maybe some might not agree with me in this point, is that I have always called that the shift and change in the foreign policies of many states in the region are very much secular in nature. You know, there is a secular behavior from states far away from any ideologies, you know, because they have realized that any foreign policy driven by any particular ideology will lead to a further conflict. And this is the case of what has been happening in the last 10 or 15 years in the region. While the UAE is trying to create more kind of a liberal-oriented foreign policy and a secular, we see other states, using particular ideologies as a tool in their foreign policy. Now, with Turkey leading the role and reducing the role of Muslim Brotherhood in its foreign policy, I think we can see a mutual interest, between these, especially those that are states that are not driven by any ideologies. So a secular behavior, I'm not calling or encouraging or whatever, for secular behavior, but I'm just saying that the analysis that what we see from regional actors is that it is a trend, it's a trend in the region that a shift and a shift from a particular, we have seen that in the 1970s, a shift from the secular Arab nationalists, and then in the 1980s, we've seen an Islamist-driven foreign policies, and then slowly fading away in the 1990s, and then re-emergence again in the early 2000s. But now what we see and have analyzed this before is that the change in the foreign policies is that because ideologies are changing in the region, are becoming less important in influencing the state, behavior. So this secular turn, I call it, is going to make a significant change in the coming years. And clearly you can see that in Saudi Arabia in particular, with Mohammed bin Salman creating the new Saudi Arabia, we'd call. I think there will be a chance and a possibility for rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which will eventually lead to bringing Egypt into this kind of discussion. So I hope that I have given some new insights, some new analysis into this GCC, Turkey, probably UAE in particular, a different perspective. But I'm sure my other colleagues will provide a much better analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid. Very interesting indeed. I encourage all our participants to start writing down their questions in the comment section or in the chatting box. We can start, gathering them. But before moving to our next guest, let me quickly summarize the main important made by Dr. Khalid. First, Dr. Khalid spoke about and confirmed Simon's point about the personalization in foreign policy and how it is driven by strong leaders, and this is a result of the centralization of power in the region. Then Dr. Khalid also spoke about structural changes motivated by exhaustion, whether in Turkey or in the UAE, after 10 years of different ventures and engagement in civil conflicts across the region. Dr. Khalid also shed the light on the lack of consensus on the GCC, citing in particular Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, not necessarily following the steps of their neighbors. And finally, also Dr. Khalid alluded to a shift away from the Islamic discourse that is not only in the GCC but across the region, adoption of a more circular narrative. Thank you again, Dr. Khalid, for this insightful contribution. And next, I will invite to the floor Dr. Kristen. Dr. Kristen Ulrichsen. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. He's a Baker Institute Fellow for the Middle East, working across the disciplines of political science, international relations, and international political economy. His research examined the changing position of the Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of long-term non-military challenges to the regional security. Dr. Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to Simon and Khalid for going first. It's a really great start to the discussion. I'm going to look at some of the regional issues that are now at play. And the de-escalation that we've seen is consistent with now, I think we can see in hindsight that we've ended a decade of confrontation, as Khalid said, a decade of confrontational policy, not just between Turkey and the UAE, but across the entire region. And a decade that really began with the fallout from the Arab uprisings in 2011, the ways in which different regional actors responded in very different ways and themselves became much more assertive and interventionist in their support for the what happens next question, the pace and direction of change in countries that either experienced a change of leadership in 2011 or that were coming under pressure in and after 2011 as well. So we had the beginning of a decade of confrontation that in the Gulf, we saw the first iteration of the Gulf crisis in 2013, 2014, and then subsequently the full-blown sort of escalation of the Gulf crisis in 2017. We also saw, as Khalid and Simon have said, we've seen Turkey and the UAE effectively supporting different sides in various conflicts around the region, most notably in Libya. We've also obviously seen the war in Yemen, which is now approaching, I think it's the beginning of its 8th year. And again, an attempt to try to determine what comes next. And we saw Gulf countries and individual Gulf leaderships taking decisions that were much more unilateralist in some ways, or on a loose block and a loose alignment in other ways. And I think in hindsight now, we can say that that decade has really come to an end. That perhaps the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 was the signal that obviously priorities have now changed, but then also it coincided, as it happened, with the at least a different international circumstances after Donald Trump lost the election in 2020. We, at least for now, have an international context that is less conducive to raw power politics. That may, of course, change at some point. Could change in 2024, 25, could change later. But we have at least entered, to some extent, a new dynamic. And I think that is the context for the rapprochement. Now, of course, some of these attempts at rapprochement predated 2020. The Saudi UAE de-escalation with Iran, for example, began in 2019. And of course, that was partly a response to the concern that the lack of an overt US response to the Iranian attributed attacks on energy and maritime facilities raised questions about the perceived security guarantees from the US, which feeds into a much wider issue of the perception of US disengagement from the region, even if it's perhaps overplayed in terms of actually dismantling the US presence, which it isn't. But of course, the perception is quite strong that under 3 successive US presidents now, Obama, Trump, and Biden, people just don't quite know where the US stands as a reliable long-term partner in regional affairs. The shock of the way the withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled and communicated and messaged as well, I think will have heightened that. And of course, it remains to be seen whether the way the US is now coordinating with international partners and allies over the Russia issue, whether that changes things. So some of the rapprochement predated 2020, began in 2018, 2019. It also obviously saw the ending of the Gulf crisis in January 2021. Perhaps not a coincidence that it happened during the transition between the Trump and Biden administrations in DC. Perhaps a feeling among all regional states that this wasn't the time for more raw power politics, but also a feeling, I think, that nothing significant had been gained from a decade of confrontation, that all parties were exhausted, at least diplomatically, if not economically, and obviously with the very different conditions and challenges of the pandemic, it was now time to see if they could work together and reap the benefits of economic cooperation, which we're now seeing from all the agreements that have been announced between Saudi Arabia, between the UAE and Turkey, and potentially between Saudi Arabia and Turkey and other parties as well. So that's how I view the de-escalation from a regional perspective. Now, will the rapprochement or reconciliation or whatever you call it between Turkey and the UAE, potentially between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, will that have a spillover effect into other Gulf monarchies? Now, I mean, I don't think there is really a spillover effect to think of, in a sense that there hadn't really been a rupture in Turkish relationships with some of the other Gulf countries in the same way there had been with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Turkey, Kuwait, Turkey, Oman, Turkey, Qatar relations had continued, and especially in the case of Turkey and Qatar, had gone from strength to strength. So in a sense, there's not so much a kind of reconciliation spillover, but perhaps more of a return to a more kind of consistent regional approach, where the Turkish relations with all the Gulf countries now are perhaps more marked by cooperative rather than confrontational aspects. And how, of course, might that affect the relationship between Turkey and Qatar? Now, of course, Turkey was drawn into the Gulf crisis in 2017 partly because it was included on the list of 13 points or demands that was made of Qatar by the Saudi, UAE, Egypt, Bahrain quartet in June 2017. One of their demands was that Turkey close its military facility in Qatar. So it was drawn in, identified by the four regional adversaries as part of what they considered to be part of the problem. And so therefore it became part of the issue. It also became part of the issue because certainly at the beginning of the Gulf crisis, the very first few days when Donald Trump had seemed to indicate, as only he knew how, on Twitter, that he was perhaps taking sides and not taking Qatar's side, perhaps bringing into question the entire basis of Qatar's external security and defense policy or posture. It was the Turkish decision, I think, on the very day that Trump tweeted, or maybe the next day, on the 7th of June 2017, the Turkish parliament rushed through ratification of a couple of agreements that would allow Turkey to station forces that would kind of activate the relationship that had been agreed several years before and allow Turkey to maintain a permanent base or facility in Qatar. It was that decision that I think was also important in illustrating to the quartet of blockading states that if you take on Qatar, you take on Turkey as well. This isn't just going to be, the attempt to isolate Qatar is not going to work, at least not going to work in the way you think it might. So I think it was important that just as when the US seemed to be pulling back and perhaps even changing sides, it was a Turks who stepped up, and certainly that led to a very strong perception that Turkey was, you had to sort of block Turkey and Qatar on the one side, UAE and Saudi Arabia on the other. Now, I don't necessarily think that the more recent rapprochement or reconciliation between Turkey and the UAE will have an impact on Turkish relationships with Qatar, partly because the Gulf crisis was resolved to the extent it has been resolved, and at least so far, there have been signs that the crisis was resolved in a more sustainable manner than in 2014. In 2014, there was an agreement, it was signed, and there didn't seem to be much follow through, whereas at least this time there were different working groups for all the various parties involved, with the exception, I think, of Qatar and Bahrain. The working groups are meeting and identifying and trying to resolve issues of specific bilateral concern. So I believe in that, within that framework, the Qatar-UAE relationship was also improved. We also saw, just as we've seen the resurrection of high-level meetings between Turkish and UAE leaders culminating in the visit by Mohammed bin Zayed to Turkey and President Erdogan to Abu Dhabi, we also saw that gradual increase in seniority in visits between Qatari and Emirati leaders, culminating in the sort of perhaps unscripted or perhaps scripted meeting between Mohammed bin Zayed and Emir Tamim at the Winter Olympics in Beijing. So the reconciliation between Turkey and UAE, I don't think will necessarily impact on Qatar-Turkish relations. I think it will just play into the general consensus in the Gulf that we're now entering sort of a different phase, at least for the next few years, of economic rather than political sort of focus. Now, of course, that may lead to different issues. We may lead to greater economic competition, especially as I think others have said, Mohammed bin Salman moves ahead with trying to establish in Saudi Arabia more of a sort of leadership position in trying to some of his economic projects. We've already seen some of his early moves, which have been perceived to have heightened a sense of economic competition with the UAE, but potentially also with others. So in a sense, there could be greater economic kind of race for a perhaps smaller post-pandemic pool of resources, especially if so much of what Mohammed bin Salman seems to be trying to do is something that the UAE has already been doing very successfully for 20 years now. He's sort of playing catch up for almost 20 years and trying to move into some of the same economic sectors. So I don't think necessarily the Turkish reconciliation there has too much sort of directly to do with perhaps some of the ways in which Gulf politics might evolve, at least in the next few years. So, I mean, is it a new realignment? Is it a new priority? Well, I think it's a new priority. It's certainly a new priority for all regional states, I think, that have perhaps come to a pragmatic assessment that the years of confrontation produced stalemates. They didn't produce clear winners and clear losers. They were producing stalemates where the cost of continuing to pour resources into not necessarily direct hot conflicts where you never really had Turkish, Emirati, or Emirati and Qatari forces physically involved against each other, but certainly pouring resources into areas in which perhaps the use of surrogates of proxies were being used. Well, that didn't produce perhaps the gains that had been expected from either side at the beginning. And so I think we've seen a pragmatic reassessment. That doesn't, as others have said, as Khalid, I think, has said, and Simon, the personalization of politics means that could change, of course. It could change in an instant, at least for the next couple of years, and especially, I think, as we emerge from the pandemic into whatever comes next, I think we'll probably be set on this new priority path for some time to come. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christian, for this very enlightening also contribution. Allow me to quickly also mark the most important points that you come across. First is that there is exhaustion. You agree with Dr. Khalid on the exhaustion dynamics that after 10 years of power politics, that led way to a more pragmatic approach. This approach has started 2 years ago. We've seen it happening in 2019 and also with the Gulf Al-Ola Summit and reconciliation also with Qatar. You also mentioned that today there is a regional consensus to move away from political-driven foreign policy to a more economical one, driven and focused approach, and this could lead the way to a different kind of competition. You also mentioned how Saudi Arabia is repositioning itself or trying to reposition itself as the leader, the economic leader of the region, which could create tension with their own neighbors. Thank you, Dr. Christian. Now I will move to Betul. Betul is an associate fellow at Sharq Strategic Research and is currently a PhD candidate, a joint degree between Qatar University Gulf Studies Centers and Durham University School of Governments and International Affairs. Betul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sinan. It's really nice to see all these names in the same webinar. And I don't know if I am lucky or not to speak after all these really well-established talks on the current reconciliation in the GCC. But I will try to summarize the point that I was asking to myself when I have seen all the changes in the region. And the basis we had with the previous 3 speeches is actually very helpful for my questions, because I have a couple of questions to myself to understand the current situation between GCC and Turkey. And all these questions are actually based on the very first question, which is asking if we really have a reconciliation between those 2 GCC countries and Turkey, or do we need to define it as a different part of our phrase of foreign policy making? So we might say that Turkey is re-accessing to GCC, Turkey is normalizing with the GCC, but I agree with the previous 3 talks that what's happening now in the GCC is too early to define as a well-established and comprehensive peace, let's say, or stability, an era that might bring stability. It is more like a practical and pragmatic readjustment of policy makings. So that's why, so I would like to start with the very technical situations that we are having in the reconciliation. So from the Turkish perspective, what's happening with the UAE and Saudi Arabia is helpful for economically and helpful for many reasons in terms of political situation that they are facing in Syria, Libya, and Egypt, and recently in Afghanistan. So we might say that this regional tension with Turkey and two GCC countries were effective in Turkey's access to other countries in the Middle East, including the other GCC countries, and also were kind of negatively effective on Turkey's economic policies, because Turkey is opening its market to the Arab world as it has done for the other global market as well. So there was a huge investment from Saudi Arabia and UAE. So this is why when we see the reconciliation since the November with the initial visits by Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan to Ankara, the initial chapters that we talked or see as a change are economic situations. So that's why both parties are eager to go through that. Even in the time of crisis, there wasn't any change in their economic cooperation, although it was limited, it was still continuous process. But when we see these growing and rising ties between UAE, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, we also need to say that in Turkish media, we see them actually kind of discussed in means of the scope of Turkey's involvement to the UAE's market and Saudi Arabia's market. So when we look at their trade volume, Turkey's share economically is quite limited. So which means although Turkey can be accessing more to the GCC, there's even more to do now to increase the role. So that's why while we are talking a reconciliation and normalization, we also need to say that the share of Turkey is quite limited, which is surprising because Turkey has been a model for many reasons in the region. It has a geographic proximity to improve the trade, and those states are actually having good diplomatic relations for a long time. So that's why I think from the perspective of Turkish policymakers, actually, the economic aspect is critical to improve it more in the future, although now at the moment they also focus on that. So another question comes to my mind. With this reaccessing to the Gulf, do we see a difference between UAE, Saudi Arabia, and the way Turkey is accessing these two countries? So we have seen that Turkey is now quicker and more easy to go with UAE and with the policymakers under this personalized relationship. But at the same time, we see that the ties with Saudi Arabia now the process is slower with Saudi Arabia. And in Turkish media, what we have seen that Erdogan says there are really positive steps between countries. They are looking forward to improve the ties, but still we couldn't see a visit. And as Simon mentioned in his speech, the visit has been delayed for many times. So we might say that here, as UAE was initiated the tension in the region towards the Turkey, now it's also initiating a diplomatic era to maybe ease the situation, but we are not able to understand the motivations behind. But I totally agree with Dr. Khaled in respect to secular policies, because my other question comes as, what about political Islam, which was a really dominant aspect in the relationship of Turkey with the GCC, not only with Qatar, but also with the other parties. It was a real part of tension. So what we have seen, this practical and pragmatic readjustment is helping them to go through the political Islam, the problems over political Islam, and the way Turkey is articulating it to its foreign policy making. So that's why we don't see, neither in the news nor in the political, statements by the leaders, we never see any talk about political Islam or any movements that they were having problems before in the bilateral ties. So that's why I have seen also a secular tendency, which is more pragmatic and practical in the foreign policy making. And my other aspect is about Iran. So since the early ties of Turkey with the GCC, Iran is an important aspect, because Turkey's role as countering Iran and balancing Iran in the region is critical, since Iran is one of the main threat perceptions in the GCC, with articulating a sectarian discourse. Turkey is secular, and most of the time long-term oriented foreign policy making was supporting its role as a balanced power in the GCC in respect to other non-Arab countries like Israel and Iran. So that's why the more Turkey is actually getting close to the Iran, and the more they share a common understanding of security framework. I don't mean a full cooperation, but I mean good diplomatic relations to go through the chapters they were having issues in Syria or maybe in Yemen. So I believe Turkey's contribution in terms of its role with Iran, including nuclear deal, might be a supportive a supportive element, a good opportunity to have more political reconciliation with the GCC. And the other question comes to my mind in respect to current reconciliations and normalizations is the regional impact. So we mentioned Iran, but there is also Syria, Yemen, Libya, Afghanistan, and we have Egypt. So neither in Turkey in the news nor in the Arab news, I haven't seen a really detailed analysis or a release by a political elite in respect to regional problems. Erdogan briefly mentioned that they are supporting any kind of anti-terrorist framework. So they are supporting the Emirati security. So they will be they will be, of course, being aside with UAE against Houthis' current target airstrike. But at the same time, we really haven't seen a detailed or comprehensive, even discursive situation over the chapters in the region they are going through as a problem between the countries. So I think this is not only an issue in foreign policy making, but also in domestic politics, because in Turkey, the UAE was a real problem in domestic politics, and it was discursively stated many times as an outsider threat, as a regional threat to Turkey's stability, Turkey's security. So now with the current shift in regional policy making, there is also an understanding in the domestic politics how the Turkish political elite will revise their approach to UAE over Syria, over Libya, and now over Afghanistan. So that's why we need also readjustment in the discourse for the domestic audience as well, on not only in Turkey, but in United Arab Emirates. So the last comment from me is, so do we really see this situation now sustainable or comprehensive enough or serious enough to see new priorities in the regional countries? It's rather, from my perspective, I agree with the previous talks, it's more like the intra-GCC rivalries and political culture in the GCC is not exactly represented in Turkish foreign policy making to the region. It's more like short-term, or let's say reactive policy making against the current situation. So that's why if we would like to see long-term, sustainable, and real steps of reconciliation, we need to see more genuine policy making and more not priority oriented, but target oriented foreign policy making. But now what we have is pragmatic and practical readjustments. So I think this is end of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Batul, also for this very well organized contribution. You mentioned how Turkey see economic opportunities to be seized in Saudi Arabia and the GCC in general, not something that has lost, but something to be built over the time. You also mentioned and agreed with the previous speakers on the retreat of the Islamic discourse in foreign policy, especially in Turkey. You alluded also to the Iranian factor. How could it play in forging new alliances or new, let's say, regional axes? And finally, you agreed also with the rest of the speakers that this seems like a short-term policy tactics and pragmatism, and that we still have to witness more movement to forge a strategic approach rather than reactive one. Last but not least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Abdullah Babood. Abdullah is an academic from Oman with wide regional and international experience. He was previously the director of the Gulf Studies Program and the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University, and the director of the Gulf Research Center at the University of Cambridge. Currently, he is the chair of the State of Qatar for Islamic Area Studies and visiting professor at the Faculty of International Research, and Education at Waseda University in Japan. Dr. Abdullah, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sinan, and it's a pleasure to be with colleagues and friends and to see them at least online and virtually. And great to meet everyone else on this panel. There is always a benefit when being the last speaker that you can benefit from all the ideas that have been brought by excellent presentations by Simon, Khalid, Christian, and Batul. And I totally agree with that. And if you like, I can recycle some of that, but hopefully we'll add some other dimensions to it. And I was also asked to talk about two other issues, which is the Qatar position and also the Oman position. But before I move into talking about Qatar and Oman, let me just say that I really concur with what has been said by all the four speakers. And I thought that was really very, they brought some very important points there. What I would like to add to that is that, the Gulf states, obviously, there is no consensus in their foreign policy, as my good friend Khalid has mentioned. But this is, of course, a well-known fact, and it will continue to be. It's very difficult to see that the GCC states will have the same foreign policy because they have different outlooks, different strategic and geostrategic calculations, but there may be some kind of a coordination between them. And what happened is that, or hopefully that will happen in the future. But what happened is also, on top of all the, the dynamics that have taken place and the shifts in the global geopolitics and geoeconomics that kind of pushed these countries to start to talk to other regional countries for reconciliation and seek cooperation. Beyond that, I think there is also the same kind of shifts also happened to Turkey. Turkey is also, subjected to its own geostrategic calculations and so on. And it takes two to tango, as it were. And Turkey is always has also been, seen itself, with its relationship within Europe, its relationship within NATO, its relationship with the United States, and of course Russia, and also the neighboring countries has also been going through some very dramatic shifts as well as a geoeconomic situation. So there were forces that also pushing Turkey to reconcile as well. And Turkey, had a policy of no problems with its neighbors. We've seen that it had a lot of problems with the neighbors. Obviously, not necessarily of its own making, but that's how the situation was. So I think Turkey want to get over that period and reconcile its relationship with the neighborhood. Obviously, Turkey has not really taken the Middle East, and particularly the Gulf states, seriously. If we look in the back history, the Gulf wasn't that important to Turkey. Turkey focused more on its relationship with Europe and NATO, and for good reasons as well. But things have changed, obviously, and Turkey started to go through a different phase where it started to look at the Middle East more seriously, and especially with the Gulf states, and initiated a dialogue with the Gulf Cooperation Council and signed the framework agreement for economic cooperation with the Gulf states, and a number of meetings have taken place at the foreign ministerial level, but also at technical level between Turkey and the GCC states as one group. And there was a talk about maybe moving forward with this cooperation to reach a free trade agreement between Turkey and the Gulf states. Obviously, for reasons pertaining to the GCC itself, but also to relationship with Turkey, this hasn't materialized. But it's not only with Turkey, but also the GCC states have had problems with other regional countries and other dialogue partners. So very quickly to move to Qatar, as we said, there is no consensus, there is no common foreign policy and security policy for the Gulf states. Qatar and Oman, and to a certain extent Kuwait, stand as an exception in their relationship with other countries, and particularly with Turkey. Qatar is, of course, one of the most important countries and for Turkey in terms of the relationship. The two countries began officially their relationship in the late 1970s with exchange of embassies and so on. But the boom of that relationship was following it followed the AK party's rise to power in 2002. And we've seen that, in the same year, Erdogan was then the prime minister. He visited Qatar alongside a number of other members of his cabinet. And the two countries signed a number of, or agreed to develop a number of relations, especially in the field of energy. But that also led to other sectors. And in 2008, there was a first Turkish-Qatari business forum that was held in Doha. And in the presence, of course, then of the Turkish president, Abdullah Gül. And in that same year, the two countries signed a memorandum of understanding to start a comprehensive cooperation in various fields. And then we've seen that, a lot of exchange and visit in 2014. At that time, President Erdogan and the Emir of Qatar, Tamim, signed an agreement to establish a joint strategic committee between the two countries. And this strategic committee held a number of annual meetings to look at, dialogue, cooperation, etc., chaired by the two leaders, as it were. And lots of, cooperation agreements and economic cooperation started to get from there, either in health or technology, scientific cooperation, intellectual property rights, etc. But one of the most important things that was signed was the military and defense cooperation that's been alluded to by my colleagues. And that was reached in 2014 when, Turkey established a small force at that time, and it was ratified again in March 2015. What happened is also Qatar stood with Turkey during the failed coup in Qatar, in Turkey, and Qatar was one of the first countries to condemn the coup, but also to to talk to the president, and Sheikh Tamim, called him, and the foreign minister of Qatar visited him, etc. So it was not just economic, but also it was political, and also it was military and political cooperation. And again, my colleagues have mentioned that there was, during the blockade of Qatar, that force that we refer to was very instrumental in, ensuring that, there was no invasion of the country, should there be one. And that really has helped Qatar. And I don't think the Qatari government would forget that, and how Turkey stood with them in terms of military, but also made food and shipments, water, medicine available to Qatar and supported Qatar politically. And in return, Qatar has invested, a lot of money in the Turkish economy, especially after the decline in the lira in 2018. And now the relationship is quite developed in many ways, where there is something like $33 billion kind of joint investment between the two countries. Each country almost invests $33 billion in each country, and trade relationship is also growing. Obviously, Qatar is a small market; it's not a huge market, but Turkish companies have benefited greatly from the the construction and the preparation for the World Cup, and from the Qatar infrastructure development. There is something like 1.5 billion projects that Turkish companies were working on in 2019. So I think this rapprochement with the other Gulf states is going to make that relationship even better. I don't see it as a challenge to the Qatari Turkish relationship. I think it will support it. Having good relationship with Saudi Arabia and of course the Emirates is going to help cement this relationship even further between the two countries. Now, and if I move very quickly because of time to just say something about Oman. Oman again had a very different policy to all the countries in the region. Oman has never really tried to get involved in any kind of political antagonism with other countries. Had tried to keep good relationship with all the countries in the region, and try to de-escalate where sometimes where the situation is where escalation was rising. So Oman has developed a strong relationship with Turkey. Oman signed memorandum of understanding in 2012, and they have there is a lot of Turkish interest now in the Duqm economic zone, where has been a lot of exchange of visitors and so on. There are a number of bilateral investments between the two countries, and I think Oman is looking Turkey as another strategic partner, along with other countries in the region, to work with and cooperate with. Oman obviously, and for good reasons, try to help de-escalation, whether it was the conflict in Yemen, whether it was the blockade, the boycott of Qatar, but also other regional issues like Syria, Libya, etc. And I think Oman sees Turkey as a major player and a large regional player that it wants to have good relationship with. Obviously, the Omani economy is not as large as maybe other GCC states, but there is a lot of interest. And I will end by saying that we have to add to this the affection for Turkish culture and Turkish media and so on, but the affection for many Omanis and Qataris and other people in the Gulf to visit Turkey, Turkish food, and the Turkish weather, and they all want to own properties in Turkey. So there is this very strong people-to-people contact that both sides can actually work on to develop a much stronger relationship. And we have missed a lot of opportunities to see that regional countries actually cooperate, but we haven't been able to take advantage of that. And if I just want to take another minute of your time, I would say we have to be very careful, and I agree with my colleagues, with this relationship, because it is also very personalized. It is, as has been said, and it could, it could go one way or the other because of the nature of politics in the Middle East. But the more cooperation, the more economic interest that we can build, it will at least help to alleviate any kind of a misunderstanding, and also it will help to stop these, personal influences interfering in the country's foreign policy, and because there will be a mutual benefit for all the region to cooperate together. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Abdullah, also for your valuable insights. To quickly summarize Dr. Baboud's main points, first, he mentioned that Turkey foreign policy to the GCC is quite recent, since the establishment of the Republic. It has gained momentum with the AKP race to power to power in the early 2000s. The relationship with Qatar is also has started around the same time and has consolidated over the time. As for the relationship with Oman, it seems that both have always enjoyed a healthy relationship, but lately, since Turkey is adopting a more reconciliatory foreign policy towards the GCC, it's found a stronger ally within Oman, who makes de-escalation a part of its foreign policy, whether not only locally within the GCC sub-regional context, but also in Syria and other countries as well. And finally, Dr. Baboud also made a very important point about the cultural power that Turkey has been harvesting the last decades, either through drama or through other cultural aspects as well. I will allow myself to gain 5 more minutes, to have 20 more minutes in total till the end of the webinar, because we have a few questions, and I would like to give each one of you the opportunity to answer to them. I will start with a couple of mine and then also add 3 more from the attendees. So my first question is that Turkey has seemed much more eager to reconcile with Saudi Arabia and Egypt than the rest of these countries. With Egypt, it sent emissary, it make a public display of its willingness to open up again to Cairo, and at each occasions they reiterate this. But and same also for Saudi Arabia. Erdogan has openly spoken to try to reopen and reignite something with Saudi Arabia. This hasn't been the case with the UAE. The UAE seems much more initiative, taking the step forward. Even though, if we look at the geopolitical map, we see the point of contentions with the UAE are more numerous than the other two. We see them in Libya, we see them in Yemen, in Somalia, we see them in Syria as well, where both stands on complete opposites. However, it seems that it's working much more. So, is it only the personalization of foreign policy, or is there more to it, especially in regards to the UAE? Why it has been working better, even though there are more contentions? The second one is that there is 2 changing, let's say, not dynamics, but events that could rearrange this dynamics. The first one could happen anytime, and it is the return of the GCPOA. We see that there is a breakthrough in the Vienna talks, and there is already they are well advanced, and Iran is positioned to have access back again to very important financial resources. How would that impact this dynamics? The second changing also event, and this could happen in 2023, which is a possible change in the government in Turkey, with the arrival of maybe potentially a coalition from the opposition, and also this would, trigger another question: why the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and any other GCC power open up to Erdogan now, where he seems weaker than, for example, waiting for 2 other 3 years and wait for another government to come into power? So these are my questions. Now, I will quickly also cite some of the questions made by our participants. So the first one is, what is the best case scenario in the improvement of ties with the UAE, asked by Mohammed Fahid. And we also have Monica Marks, who asked about the role of Saudi Arabia in obtaining or giving the UAE an approval or a green light to reconcile with Turkey. And the second question, also from Monica, is if Turkey's economy improves, will Erdogan stop this reconciliation with the GCC? And I have also a question on Yemen, citing that there could be some expectation from Turkey to intervene in the in Yemen, and how would this be perceived locally and in the GCC? Will it, enhance Turkey public picture or not? So I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with these questions. I will leave each one of you 3 to 4 minutes to answer the questions that you would like to answer. And I will start with Dr. Abdullah.
Oh, thank you. It's difficult to remember all. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you very well. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer to all those questions, or do you want me to just take one of them, or maybe just ask me 1 or 2?
Whichever you feel comfortable with.
I think let's start with the last one I remember, which is, Turkey involvement in the war in the region in Yemen. I think obviously there is an interest from especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE to get some support from Turkey in this war, and especially if it wants to end the war. And if that is the case, I think Turkey will be a very important player in terms of helping to end the war, because it has some influence in the region, and especially amongst one would say maybe the Brotherhood group there. However, if the idea was to get Turkey to be involved in the war, I think that will only complicate the picture in this very long and very difficult war. I think Turkey could actually help to reconcile, help to get the 2 sides to sit together and end it, because as everyone knows, there is no military solution to this war, and it's only through dialogue and diplomacy that can be done. And I think Turkey can play a very important role there. But I think other maybe countries are looking for more Turkish arms, especially drones, etc., and drone technology and this. So it depends really what Turkey wants to take, what kind of role it wants to take. There was a question about if Turkey economy improves, will it change? I don't think so. I think there is, as my colleagues have said, there is obviously a sense of realization and a sense of fatigue in these conflicts. And I think Turkey sees the Middle East and sees the region with all its problems, but it sees it as it's you know, an area where it can have a sphere of influence in the region, and it can play a very important role, especially with what we are seeing in terms of, you know, more connectivity between the region, in terms of, you know, new roads and new routes, with the Chinese moving in as well into the region, the Belt and Road. All of that, I think, would want to push Turkey to work more with the region, even if its economy improves. I think this is a genuine tilt, if you like, towards the region in that sense. I don't know if you want me to answer any other questions, but is Saudi Arabia has given you know, its green light to the UAE? I don't think anyone can answer that because, again, it's difficult to tell, but I think the UAE obviously tries to coordinate its policy. I think my colleague Khaled, especially from the UAE, he could answer that better. But from my own perspective, I would say that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, they try to reconcile their policies, but sometimes the UAE goes its own way because it sees it in its very best interest, and that is legitimate as well. So I'm not sure if there has been an agreement on this, but I think the UAE feels the need to open up to Turkey, especially given the attacks on the UAE in the recent days and recent weeks. So, and it sees Turkey is another strategic partner, and we can see that it is opening to Iran. And we've seen also what's happening with Israel, with the Abraham Accord. So the UAE is trying to open to everyone in the region, trying to, you know, reconcile its position, to de-escalate, to build friends, and so on. I think those are some of the questions that I remember. Do forgive me, Sinan, because I don't remember all of them, but I'm sure some of my colleagues can take some others.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abdullah. Very insightful as usual. But your last answer is, I would say, use it as a segue to Dr. Khalid, and maybe he can help us, you know, shed more light on both this question about the green light, whether it exists or not, and the second one is, why has it worked better with the UAE, even though there is more contentious than Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where potentially it could be easier?
Thank you, Sinan. Well, I agree with most what Dr. Abdullah has said, but in regards to the question of if UAE needs approval or from Saudi Arabia, I think yes, it is definitely that this is a difficult question. But we need to think, even during the last couple of years, that there were talks that Mohammed bin Salman is very much influenced by Mohammed bin Salman, right? If this was the case, then one would say, well, UAE now has very much an independent foreign policy. It seeks its interest in the region. And we have seen that clearly in the last couple of years, that the UAE foreign policy is becoming much more clear, with the clearer strategies for 10 or 5 or 10 years. And I think my humble opinion is that I think there might be some coordination, but UAE is very much more independent than before, you know, when it comes to making what is best for its foreign policy or its interests in the region. Looking at Turkey, I think it's a strong economic partner in the region. And also Turkey looks at the wider market also in the UAE. Even if we look at Saudi Arabia and Egypt, say, well, they are much bigger markets and are more beneficial for the Turkish economy. However, the UAE, the politics in UAE works much easier and has a much clearer policies in the long term, and therefore we see them working much faster than other actors in the region. All right, and as I said at the very beginning, when that UAE has decided that they have a clearer strategies for the next 10 years or the 50 years in regard to their foreign policy. Friendlier neighbors, cooperating with regional actors, and so on. So it is very much an economic driven foreign policy in the coming years. And that's what I think why UAE has moved faster than Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And I agree also with Abdullah that the case of Turkey will not change its foreign policy toward the Gulf if they are financially better off, in the coming years. And therefore, I don't think there will be any change. But going back to some of the questions that has been asked, also on the chat, I was just looking at them from Monica in particular. The question of Iran, I think what we're seeing there is some kind of optimism about the signing of the or revival of the GCPOA. I think Turkey and the GCC can work together towards having a much more better opportunities with Iran if there will be some kind of an agreement that fulfills the objectives of Turkey, of Iran and the European countries. And the last point on someone, I think you asked also questions regarding, if I'm not mistaken, about the role of Turkey in Yemen. I think I agree with Dr. Abdullah that it is very much difficult for Turkey to get involved in a conflict that it is going the opposite directions for the Gulf states. It's not. Has not achieved its objectives, particularly for the Saudis, and therefore Turkey will not involve, and it does not have the financial capabilities, but has the military. But because it's bordering Iran, I think this is something that we have to take in consideration. I'm not sure, Sinan, if I have answered all the questions, but if there is anything else that I can add to.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Khalid.
Thank you.
And Dr. Christian, would like also to hear your opinion about the same question, and if you can also particularly focus on the GCPOA and revival. How could it be perceived? How could it be a catalyst of a different dynamic in the region?
Okay, thank you. Well, I mean, the JCPOA will then raise questions as to how that then ties into the ongoing discussions between Saudi and Iranian officials. The Saudis clearly want the JCPOA to be the beginning of a further dialogue on issues that are more of concern to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf countries, including Iran's support for regional destabilizing groups and transfer of missile technology to those groups. So in a sense, we may see from the US perspective or the European perspective, the JCPOA revival is a sort of end process. And I think very much in the region, it's seen as the beginning of a new process, which may or may not happen. I don't necessarily think that will shift the relationship between Turkey and the Gulf countries, but it's, again, as you say, another piece of the puzzle. And clearly, Gulf states diplomacy will be focused on trying to move from any JCPOA 2.0 towards any form of kind of dialogue with Iran on issues of specific concern to them. I also agree with the other speakers about Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the concept of a green light. I think the UAE in Yemen, for example, in 2019, when the UAE chose to redeploy, not necessarily withdraw, but redeploy its forces and to kind of withdraw from the areas around Hodeidah. They didn't do so with Saudi, the green light from Saudi Arabia. In fact, they did the opposite. The Saudis, I think, found out after the fact, and it did create a degree of friction between the two countries. Now, again, it was very much a pragmatic assessment by the UAE that that policy that they've been following was not producing the desired results, and then it was time to start following a new policy. And I suspect that with Turkey, again, there's been a pragmatic calculation made, both in Abu Dhabi and also in Ankara, that this is what's in the best interest of both countries, not necessarily what's in the best interest of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis and Mohammed bin Salman will come to their own decision about what's in their interests if and when they make that choice. And I think finally, the last question I'll look at, again, others have spoken to, is about Yemen. And I mean, the question was about Turkish intervention. And I mean, obviously, I think it would be quite unlikely that Turkey to intervene militarily. It would be quite foolhardy as well, given the way that the intervention has gone so far. But of course, if and when we ever do begin to get towards some sort of post-conflict or sort of reconstruction and recovery phase in Yemen, which may happen this year, may happen next year, may not happen for some time to come. But if and when we do get to a point where there's a post-conflict phase, then the question then is, could Turkish companies be involved in reconstruction? Could they be involved in humanitarian assistance? I mean, I think then there would be a potential opportunity for Turkish and other regional and international entities to sort of become involved. I don't think we're talking about getting involved in a military phase now. I mean, but obviously if and when we get to a different phase, that could change the dynamic in the calculus.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christian. And Betul, we're touching, based with the end of the webinar. So if you can maybe answer the question about the possible impact of a probable change in ruling coalition in Ankara on Turkish GCC relations, especially given that the Turkish foreign policy in the GCC has been quite, created champion also by the AKP, wherein that existing before. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinan. I might mention, as the previous speaker said, because the relationship between GCC countries and Turkey quite personalized, anything will be different in Ankara, of course, will be effective on the multilateral ties and bilateral ties. But also, it's really important to remember that the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are investing on key Turkish sectors like defense industry or some other infrastructural projects. So although we might have a change in political atmosphere in Turkey, but none of these projects are for short term. There is, at least for 5 to 6 years to go through with some of them. So I think the business might be dominating the political situation, especially in the economic cooperation. But in terms of political cooperations or the cultural cooperations that were actually more part of a personal proximity between the leaders or more part of non-governmental organizations, let's say, we might see a change. But I totally agree with Dr. Christine and the others mentioning the Turkey's role in Yemen. In a post-war atmosphere in Yemen, we will see many parties competing for a potential economic or for a business restructuring Yemen, or we might see even again intra-GCC rivalry for more economic gain out of a new structural projects, etc. So I think in this respect, Turkey might be part of it. So I think these are my brief comments about the questions.
Thank you very much, Betul. Unfortunately, Simon internet problem came back, but we were lucky enough to have him during his intervention, very valuable one. We're coming at the end of this webinar, so I would like to thank each one of you, speakers as well as participants, to have attended this very rich and stimulating debate. You will find the recording of this webinar on our YouTube channels tomorrow, so please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues on social media. Thank you again on behalf of Truck Forum for this very valuable insights, and we look forward to hosting you many times again in the future. Thank you very